I'm wondering if there's a business model around producing green hydrogen in connection to solar and wind
Yes.
or connection to the grid.
Mm-hmm.
What's the starting point here? What are the key elements to going about this?
I love the question. Here we are again.
Beautiful. How are you doing today?
Amazing. Great day today.
Great. So I'm excited because today we're gonna look at or talk a little bit about the key things in order to develop a hydrogen project.
Yes, green hydrogen project, right?
A green hydrogen project,
Yes.
which is very important. So so let's just assume that I'm a project developer.
Mm-hmm.
I have experience with developing maybe solar parks or wind parks.
Yes.
Can be operating a little bit anywhere in the world.
Yes.
But right now I'm getting questions around can you guys can you produce hydrogen? And I'm wondering if there's a business model around producing green hydrogen in connection to solar and wind
Yes.
or connection to the grid.
Mm-hmm.
What's the starting point here? What are the key elements to going about this?
I love the question. So I think this is very challenging for developers, project developers, energy companies coming from renewables or from energy development, for that matter, because normally when you have let's say electricity production kind of project, it's much more straightforward. You know that you need to install your project, have a connection point normally to the grid, and then you have an offtaker or a client somewhere at some point of the grid. You might have different sort of contracts, bilateral contracts, normally known as power purchase agreements, and that depends on the market where you are connected. But let's say the step-by-step procedure that you follow, it's very well known.
Mm-hmm.
And for hydrogen, where you are producing a gas and you cannot inject it to a grid, the way of doing projects it's very different.
Right.
So and there are different reasons for that, right? So hydrogen is difficult to transport. Historically, we have always produced hydrogen in the spot where we consume hydrogen. And so to answer the question, really, I would say the most important thing, the first point that you have to have is it's a case. You need to have an off-taker. You have to you have to understand where is that hydrogen going to be consumed and how.
So before in my solar and wind projects, the off-taker would be like a utility company or like end customers on the electricity grid. Who's my off-taker now when I'm all of a sudden trying to produce hydrogen here?
Yeah, exactly. So when you produce electricity, you characterize your demand in terms of power, point of connection, and profile of consumption, and that's basically it. There are, of course, many more specific factors, but that's your demand mainly. When you do hydrogen, you need to understand why you are going to have hydrogen production, where you're going to produce it, how important is the carbon footprint, at what pressure you're going to consume it. Do you have any way or do you have any space to store hydrogen, to have different level of buffers at different pressures? Is it the feedstock for some other chemical processes? Are you using it for energy? Can you produce it far away and transport it? Should you produce it locally?
Mm-hmm.
What does that imply in terms of carbon footprint if you consume electricity from the grid, for example? I'm talking here about the electrolytic hydrogen, right?
Yeah.
So it's much more complex. So the first step would be identify who needs or who has a need or who might have a need for green hydrogen. And then the detective work is the work of the developer. Understand and characterize the demand.
So which are the main categories here on the off-taker? I mean, we heard about the green ammonia being an off-taker of hydrogen, the steel industry,
yes,
that are converting, especially here in Sweden.
Yes.
What else do we have on the list?
It will depend to a larger extent on the market where you are geographically. So, for example, if you are in Chile, a lot of people might be interested in producing ammonia for exportation or even for explosive productions because it's a mining country. That's also the case in Australia. Australia is very close to Japan. Japan has announced that they are going to completely use hydrogen in most aspects of their economy. So Australia, for example, is looking to produce hydrogen, and a lot of initiatives are to produce hydrogen to export to Japan. If you are in Sweden, you want to produce hydrogen to sell to one of these big consortia that are trying to use hydrogen for the steel production, right? So the production of steel. So it will depend where you are in the world, and it changes a lot, and the way you use it, and that means also pressure, how you produce it. So will change a lot. It's not a commodity, and I would say each part of the process it might be very different for different processors, different countries, and so on. So it's quite challenging.
Yeah. So okay, so big challenge there with the off-taker. Let's say I find a company. It's let's say it's an ammonia plant or some industry here that
mining company that needs to decarbonize their trucks.
Yeah, that could also be.
Yeah.
Right. So I found an off-taker that is interested. So first interest there. What is the next step for me as a developer?
So I would say, and this is true probably for all type of developments, you need to understand what's the reason for that off-taker to want the hydrogen. And when I mean the reason, it's not about whether it makes sense or not. It's about if you understand the metrics or the KPIs your off-taker is it's going for, then you can do a better project, right? So is it to decarbonize? Then perhaps you can allow a little bit more expensive production, or is it to reduce cost from I don't know, offsetting the cost of using fossil fuels? Then you need to do a techno-economical optimum project, and perhaps you don't have problems of capex, so perhaps you can oversize your electrolyzers and produce everything only during solar hours. And then you can, if you have access to project finance, you'll be able to reduce the so-called LCOH, or the levelized cost of hydrogen. But perhaps capex is a problem, and then you don't want to have a super oversized system. You want to reduce 24/7. Then you'll pay most likely for more expensive electricity and so on. So you need to understand what are the boundary conditions, we say in engineering, of your off-taker, so you can optimize the project for that off-taker, and then you can compare. The off-taker normally is going to ask, like, how much more expensive is this going to be, or am I going to reduce the cost of my energy supply, which is not always obvious, right? You might have completely different configurations. Perhaps the off-taker is just it's super important for the off-taker to reduce the carbon footprint, because they can pass that in their final product, so they can differentiate in the market depending on what they are doing in the market, if they're producing a commodity and so on.
Right.
So
yeah. So what I'm hearing is, like, you need to figure out the willingness to pay here, at the same time as you need to figure out what are the conditions for you to produce and at which price, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a theme here, where
the willingness to pay
coming.
It's just one factor. I think willingness to pay is one of the factors you need to figure out. But the big picture is, why would you want to use the hydrogen? So I can then build or propose or start designing the best possible solution for that case, and then we'll start with the iteration. But as we said in the first question, each hydrogen project is so different, and the configurations might be so different, that you need to somehow understand what would be the main drivers for your optimal configuration, and the one that will create the most value for the off-taker.
Right. Great.
So that would be, I would say, the two main factors.
Yeah. So all right. So let's say there is a willingness to pay more, and there's a value for the off-taker to go green rather than sticking to the old the fossil fuel alternative.
Yes.
So then how do I figure out the costs of me producing? How do
Right.
I go about, like, offering these guys something that fits into their boundary conditions, as you put it?
So the technoeconomic analysis, then
That's
this is what you can use Southern Lights for, right? The software we do. But this is a great question, because of course, as in anything in life and in business, you have cost, you have price, and you have value. So the first thing you figure out is that you can satisfy the demands of the client. So you can meet the hydrogen production goal, if it's for a year, maybe for a month or for a week. So you have in place there the technology for storage. You have in place, you make sure that you have a certain configuration of project that can supply the needs of your client. And then you need to optimize that. What you would usually do, if you don't have a software that is meant exactly for that, is that you spend a lot of hours with your internal teams, engineering teams, or you would spend a lot of money with a consultancy company figuring out what would be, for example, what is the electrolyzer that makes sense. right? So some electrolyzers are more flexible than others. So perhaps if you have a project that is connected to the grid, you don't need that flexibility. Perhaps you might still need it and then provide ancillary services to the grid. So there is a lot of decisions that are to be made there. Technology selection is one of them. Technology sizing is one of them. It is not obvious what is the size of an electrolyzer. So if I have a 100 megawatt solar park, it is not obvious how many megawatts or how much electrolyzer capacity do I need to install.
Right.
You know, the AC-AC ratio, what is that we call it in a publication we issued last year. So technoeconomic analysis, it's complex. And we try to make that easy with Southern Lights in the software, of course. But the bottom line is first figuring out the cost and then understanding if that is in a range of pricing that you can charge, but always making sure that the value that you're providing to the customer is it's higher than the pricing. And yeah.
All right. So sounds like a tough challenge there to figure out the matching here between the price and the.
Well, it is challenging. I think we've seen this. I've seen this so much during doing consultancy. You've seen that also with our clients of the software. It's much more complex than doing solar projects or wind projects. Even though the technology seems straightforward, when you have many components, at the end you have a big black box where you put electricity and water and you get hydrogen, and then the more you have the ability to open that black box and make it a gray box and see all the little black boxes within, the more you will be able to have a sound project, a project that is bankable, a project that you can actually predict how it's going to produce hydrogen, how it's going to degrade with the years, how much it's going to cost. Then you'll have a better business case. So you de-risk the project if you have these things. And it's very important because the technology is new already. Right? So you have that risk from the get-go. You don't want to have the risk of, on top of that, not sizing the project correctly.
Right. You want to make sure that you can produce in the end at the price and in a way that is suitable for your offtaker.
Exactly. And you don't want to waste a huge amount of resources to do that because you are probably assessing 10 projects or even 100 projects before you build one, or you go to ready to build. That's the term from greenfield to ready to build, or from scratch to ready to build in the project development market.
Right.
So you don't want to spend a huge amount of money.
Right. So you should screen a lot of opportunities there.
We need to get good at this. Same way we got good at this in solar and wind in the past.
Right. All right. So say I've done my homework. I've screened a lot of different project opportunities. I have a lot of different off-takers, and there's some here now that are, they're quite sizable, some of these hydrogen projects, right?
Yes.
10 megawatts is no longer considered enormous. 100 megawatts, 500 megawatts, that's where we're talking. So of course there's going to be a bunch of environmental impact. There's water consumption. There's land use. There's all these factors. So permitting, of course, comes in as a thing. And what is the challenges there?
Well, permitting it's I would say an obvious thing, and I would guess that our auditors would be very familiar with permitting because you do a lot of permitting in energy projects. But I think one thing that is very important is if you're doing a 500 megawatt project, as the projects that we are seeing in Middle East or in Australia or in the south of Chile or in China, you are gonna probably face, and you need to do these projects at this scale for the hydrogen to be economic feasible in many applications, or even to couple it to a Haber-Bosch cycle to produce ammonia. So these are the scales of some of these processes. So these projects need to be big and large in many cases. But then it is very important to consider from the get-go not only the environmental impacts, which are absolutely crucial and of the highest importance, but also the social impact. If you have 2 or 3 projects in Patagonia, for example, you might face resistance from communities if communities haven't participated in the project from the get-go. So I think that it's very important that companies learn how to incorporate and how to make the community participate in these projects, because the community has the right, of course, to have reservations on what is going to be the environmental impact of this. Why does it make sense that we use a considerable amount of land, for example, in the case of the energy production, for us to produce the green hydrogen? So in most of cases, I would say it will probably make sense if we're using then this to decarbonize the industry and to reduce the carbon footprint of our economy. But the community, it's normally smarter than what the industry might expect. And as long as you incorporate from the beginning and the project makes sense for them, I think that's something that then will allow us to make better projects.
Right.
So social and environmental aspects, but not only permitting, but involving and engaging with the community from the get-go, I would say, for these mega projects.
Yeah, I've seen that in some of the Australian projects where they really try to involve the indigenous tribes from the beginning, and even getting them ownership as a part, and also working with desalination rather than taking scarce freshwater supplies. So,
and I think it's the most cost-effective as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah,
it's not pure altruism. It's not we're not hippies or anything. It's what makes sense from a business perspective as well. Yeah. It's the good way of doing business. Yeah, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
Maybe back in the days you could actually just do your thing and not care about these things, but we're way past that era.
Yeah.
And now you have to take responsibility. Of course, it's very good. So on the list now we have the offtaker. We have the economic analysis to understand the costs, etc. Permitting being a big one. What else do you want to add on the list here?
Well, I guess logistics it's a very hard one in general. It's a little bit linked to the technical side that we mentioned before, but I would say logistic or handling the hydrogen. If you're not gonna consume the hydrogen in the same spot that it's being produced, it's hard. There is technology available, but we need to remember as well that this technology in general it's new. To move hydrogen from one place to the other is not something we have been doing for long. So normally, I think it's more than 95% of the hydrogen produced in the world is produced where you consume it, which is not the case of, for example, I don't know, oil or gas. We can move that, right? So that might present challenges, and also it would be interesting, for example, in some cases to compare whether you produce locally, connecting to the grid, or having your own system locally, or going where the renewable energy resource is very, very, very much low cost, and then transporting it from that place to where you are going to consume it. And then there is a full discussion about how to, promote the existence of hubs. So perhaps your neighbor need heat, or he need, another part of the process where you are producing hydrogen, or perhaps he needs hydrogen as well. So if you can have these synergies, and think this is also a little bit of policy, not only for the project developer, of course, to design, but if you can be part of a hub when consuming your hydrogen hub, that would be very beneficial, I would guess.
Right. Yes. So that also goes into the off-taker sometimes doesn't have to be right on site. You can actually be part of a hub and maybe or sell your hydrogen as a derivative or in its pure form to other sources.
Yes. And then that reminds me as well, if you do go for your own solar or wind system, always remember that optimizing your solar park to produce the lowest possible electricity is not necessarily what you want. So the optimization of the energy system needs to happen all together, because if you optimize a solar park, let's say for a LCOE or minimization of LCOE, you will end up with DC-AC ratio, which is a technical part of the project that might be one number. But then if you optimize all together, considering hydrogen production and solar production, everything coupled, then the optimal ratios and sizing ratios between your project change. So take a look at the project, not segmented, but as a whole.
Right. You've written a paper on that, on the solar park. We should do it. Its own episode on solar to hydrogen optimization, because that's going to be very interesting.
Yes. Glad to do that.
There was something else on my mind on this list. Yeah, of course. I mean, now we're talking about all the project planning we're doing before the project's being built, and when we're approaching the stage where we're actually going to build, the technology needs to be in place, right? We need to have an OEM on board, the original equipment manufacturer. And I hear now that the lead times of electrolyzers are quite long. Yes. And the process of securing this technology for the project is challenging as well.
Yes.
What do you know about that thing?
Well, the fact is that the request for quotations in general for hydrogen technology have surpassed completely the capacity of the OEMs today in the market to supply those quotations or those sales. Now that's probably normal to a certain extent. Of course, you have in general more projects being assessed than the projects being built. However, one thing that we have heard from OEMs is that a lot of the leads that come or a lot of the clients that request quotations don't have proper assessments of their projects. So then it's being challenging, I think, for some OEMs to prioritize or to deal with their own sales channel. And I think one smart way to go about it is to get to the OEM with a project pre-assessed that makes sense, that it's sound, and then for the OEMs to take you seriously and to say, all right, then this is a real project. This is a project that has an off-taker. This is a project that it's going to happen, and then they'll prioritize you. Having said that, it's of course true as well that today there is a big lead time. There is a lot of projects, not enough to be on track with our challenges to decarbonize the economy by 2030, but a lot of projects, which is an amazing good sign. A lot of OEMs are signing also projects to increase their capacity production in the coming years. So it's very exciting times, and it's hard to go about it. There is a lot of uncertainties in some cases. We'll see what will happen with different OEMs, component providers for those OEMs as well. So the companies that produce membranes, electrodes. So I think we will see a consolidation of the market and a lot of probably merger and acquisitions in the coming years.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so exciting to see so many players and so many new technologies that you hear about, new electrolyzers going up in efficiency, going down in degradation. It's just exciting.
Yeah, great. We also hear a lot about the tension, or not tension, but the competition between European suppliers, Chinese, US now focusing on internal
yes,
national production of these things.
There is some concern in European Union to protect the technology that is being produced in the European Union, and I think that a good example to look at is what happened with solar and wind. So in wind technology, I think it's pretty clear now that the dominant technology above all providers, in general, it's the technology being manufactured and produced and now to a certain extent also designed in China. That is pretty clear. They are very dominant in the market. However, in the wind market, which one might think it's very similar, there are like two separate tracks. Like you have the European producers and the European designers being still very competitive and being able to differentiate a little bit from their Chinese competitors. So I guess that the goal of the European Union is to have an electrolyzer market that is more similar to what we see in wind, which is also a technology that is more complex, which is also the case of electrolyzers. Now, Chinese industry has evolved a lot, I think. Also this, you have a lot of experience in the solar PV, and you've seen like the huge progress, the industrial progress that the Chinese have done. They are doing very good batteries nowadays as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an exciting race. Let's see who wins it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also there, I mean, we should mention that in using Southern Lights can be a way to compare different technologies, different suppliers of electrolyzers as well. And like you say, getting to that first assessment of making your project realistic before the OEM really takes you seriously can be really valuable.
Yes. Bottom line, there are no better options that you can say from the get-go, this is the best technology, because that will depend on what are your needs as an off-taker, as a client, or even as a project developer. Some developers have the philosophy of going with a little bit lower cost technology and then bear the replacement cost. The cost of the technology is coming down very sharply, so that might not be a problem. Other technologies like to design for projects that are more reliable. So there are different philosophies there.
Yeah. Great. So there we have a quite complete list of the main things you need to. Of course, there's a lot more to consider, and
each one of the topics might be a podcast, I think.
Yeah, exactly. we could have the specific episode for each one, but it's good to get this overview of what it actually takes to build a hydrogen project, and like you said, very different from running the solar and wind projects that many are familiar with in the renewable industry.
Definitely. All right then.
Great. Let's wrap that up.
Thank you so much.
And see you in the next episode.
Have a good one.